Okay, I suggest we start. So welcome everyone to this third webinar in September, the third September webinar focused on concrete case studies related to the implementation of a nature positive approach at an entity level. Next slide. Just some house rules, like also the previous times: mute yourself to avoid background noise, turn off your cameras to avoid technical disruptions. Be aware the meeting is recorded, will be shared online on the BNB platform's website afterwards. You can always express your questions and comments by means of the chat box, and we'll take them after the presentations of the different presenters. As far as possible, of course, if time allows. Okay, and of course, I don't have to tell you, respect opinions of others and share your own opinion. So next slide. So today we have again an interesting panel of speakers. We have two concrete case studies. We have the case study of Oxford University, which will be presented by Joe Bell. We have the case of, we have also a sectoral case study, which is presented by SEM Bureau, Alexandra Silva, so the European Federation of the Cement Industry. And then we had a case study from Burberry's, the textile manufacturing company in the UK, but at the very last moment, unfortunately, they had to decline. So they will be replaced by some testimonies by the Biodiversity Consultancy with regard to implementing nature positive, and Katie Fensom will be our presenter. Can I please ask everyone to put him or herself on mute? Yeah, to avoid background noise. Thank you. All right, and then at the end we have time for a Q&A and a final wrap-up. But first I will start with giving an introduction on the case study webinars. Next slide, please. Yeah, so next slide. So within the EU Business and Biodiversity platform, we have decided to do some efforts with regard to the clarification of the concept of nature positive, especially with regard to the implementation of the concept within a business context, because we saw that there were many different interpretations on what nature positive is, or what it could mean within a business context, and also how to implement it. And of course, this opens the door for greenwashing and so on, for inappropriate claims of companies that declare themselves nature positive, and that's of course something that we absolutely want to avoid. So therefore, we took the initiative to start with this webinar series with a number of very concrete case studies, and also based on an assumption of what the definition of nature positive could be. So starting from the global goal for nature, which is the so-called equivalent of the net zero emissions goal in the climate space. We have this global goal for nature, for biodiversity, but also for other nature components, as a kind of a similar pole star. It means that we need to halt and reverse nature loss measured from a baseline of 2020, and we should try to reverse that by 2030, and we should try to go on a pathway to full recovery by 2050. This is in short the global goal for nature. I don't have to explain you, I think. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, it has become a very hot issue these days. Many companies want to be nature positive, they want to adopt a nature positive strategy and so on. But as I said, many different interpretations, so with an absolute need to try to come up with some consensus on what it really means. Next slide. So this is really about the how to implement it. What does it mean when a company really adopts a nature positive strategy, or even wants to be nature positive on itself? Yes, next slide. So the ambition of the webinar series is to explore the feasibility of becoming nature positive at an entity level based on a common understanding of the scope, the concept of net positive, what does it really mean, and on a number of implementation and reporting principles, which I will explain within a minute. We do this by means of case studies and interaction with the audience, with the simple aim to bring the debate on nature positive a few steps forwards. Next slide. The key questions that we have asked each presenter to address are the following. Can my company ever be nature positive, or is that simply impossible based on this current working definition that we have developed? Or would you as a company or a sector rather be fine with adopting a nature positive strategy and walking a journey towards nature positive with the aim to come as nearby as possible? Of course, respecting a number of principles. And these principles are the following. We have 3 principles on scope. I must say that you all have received the note and the background note with an explanation of all these principles. You can have a look again afterwards if you want. You are always invited to provide your comments on these principles. These are very welcome because, of course, this is work in progress. This will be further improved based on your inputs. On scope, I will be very short. Nature, of course, is much more than only biodiversity. It also includes climate, it includes water, both freshwater, also oceans, and it includes also land. So meaning nature positive implies also water positive, biodiversity positive, carbon neutrality at least, land degradation neutrality, or zero deforestation, zero land conversion. All parts of the value chain need to be covered and all material impacts need to be covered. One thing I forgot to mention, this working definition is based on the review of a number of academic papers that are circulating, a number of discussion papers that are circulating or are under development. So we are not reinventing the wheel, we are just bringing it all together in a number of very simple bullet point-wise principles. Net positive means that the positive impacts outweigh the negative impacts through the value chain. The net balance is positive. We are also advocating that it is about absolute impacts, not about relative impacts compared to the business as usual scenario, because relative impacts can still go downward on the curve of the figure that I just showed. And of course, balancing negative impacts with positive impacts, and that's particularly the case for biodiversity, needs to be with respect to a number of principles, for instance, the ecological equivalency principles. You cannot simply replace trees by an increase in fish populations, to just name something. Okay, a few things on implementation principles. Mitigation hierarchy is absolutely essential to start with, in combination with proactive measures to achieve conservation targets, which go beyond the impact that you are causing as a company. So it's really about not only about restoring the historical damage, but also to go much beyond your own activities and to contribute to achieving the global restoration efforts, especially on the curve higher up to 2050. That's sometimes called the conservation hierarchy. But first you need to apply or implement the full spectrum of possibilities in the mitigation hierarchy. Transform is also very dominant in all the papers. For many sectors, it will require a drastic transformation of your business model or your production processes in order to continuously generate more positive nature impacts and negative nature impacts. Smart target setting, preferably based on science-based targets, is also key, of course, and we are also very much in favor of this so-called ratcheted commitment target setting, which means that you can start with feasible targets in the beginning to allow you to step in, but you need to commit to continuously stretch your ambitions over time, every 2 to 3 years. Next slide. Then we have another principle on integration. meaning that the different nature components should not be considered in isolation from each other. Of course, they all require their own measurement approaches, but at the end, you need to avoid that measures that you take in favor of achieving positive outcomes for one component, that these measures are not negative or harmful for other nature components. So you need to take this very well into account. Nature positive also means that the mindset of the full company should be aligned in terms of achieving nature positive outcomes. So it's not only something for the sustainability department. Another thing is that achieving nature positive works best when you collaborate with other actors, because on your own it will be very difficult to achieve nature positive outcomes, for instance, at a landscape scale. We are very much in favor of applying as a company the nature positive concept together with other sector representatives and or other actors in the landscape. So 2 dimensions of collaboration. Then about the time part, we always see these rigid figures of 2020 and 2030. This might be the preferred option because that's completely in line with the curve of the global goal for nature. But we think some flexibility might be useful for companies stepping in, for instance, next year or the year after, because it will be very difficult for those companies to reconstruct the baseline in 2020. So yeah, a little bit of flexibility. That leads us to 2 kinds of ambition levels. The so-called full, next slide please, the so-called full nature positive company, which complies completely with all these principles. But of course, this is extremely challenging. But you can also have companies, and this will be the far majority of the companies, having adopted a nature positive strategy, meaning they are on a journey towards nature positive, they are contributing with the aim to get as close as possible to being fully nature positive. Yeah, and then we can still consider the possibility to differentiate between different levels of having achieved a nature positive strategy, like we do for climate. We have for climate the gold standard, the silver standard, the bronze standard. This might be something to consider also in terms of nature positive. And the next slide on the reporting principles. Of course, it's very important that you have to demonstrate that you are making progress and that you are really sticking to these principles. So you need to be fully transparent about the baseline that you have set, your targets, your progress over time, your actions, but also about the challenges preventing you to go a step further. For instance, I have no data at all about the sourcing locations in my supply chains, which is a reasonable argument in many cases. And of course, external disclosure needs to be underpinned with quantitative information as much as possible, and external disclosure should preferably be verified and certified by independent auditors. We have developed a format for reporting and for use in these webinar series. So we have asked the presenters to try to present the achievability of nature positive for the different parts of the value chain and the different nature components in this very simple matrix. So with some very easy to digest dashboard of, okay, is this achievable or not? Maybe achievable or not achievable at all? And what are maybe the challenges that you are facing? And this is what the presenters, a large part of the presenters has done so far. And this gives us a very nice picture of the feasibility of achieving nature positive in very concrete case studies. And it learns us a lot about the challenges on this pathway. This is for the introduction. Now I would like to give the floor to the first speaker, which is Joseph Bow, Associate Professor in Climate Change Biology at the University of Oxford. Joe, we are happy to listen to your story.
Thank you, Johan, for that excellent introduction. That's really painted a useful picture. Can you hear me okay, by the way? Is my sound okay? Just to confirm.
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you everyone for joining. It's a good audience here, which is fantastic. So I'm going to talk about the application of the concept of nature positive to the University of Oxford, which is where I'm now based. I wasn't when I started this work, but I am now. Next slide, please. So one thing to pull out first of all, the origin of this work came out of the new environmental sustainability strategy developed by the university. And now, first thing to say is that covers the university itself. It doesn't cover all the colleges, which obviously people think of as part of the university, but which are actually different legal entities. So this is focused on the University of Oxford itself. Approved this new strategy in 2021. And the second thing to pull out is that there's two headline objectives, two headline targets for the Oxford Sustainability Strategy. One is around net zero carbon, and the other is biodiversity net gain. So to be very clear, there's no specific nature positive goal, nature positive explicit goal for the University of Oxford. It's biodiversity net gain. We could probably spend a long time talking about the differences or not between those two terms, but just to flag that for everyone who's listening. So the idea was to, having decided to set these kind of targets at the level of the entire university, the next step was to understand what the baseline impacts were. And that's where we came in, first of all. So if we go to the next slide, please. We had a couple of reports. The first, back in 2020, was when we attempted to carry out a comprehensive assessment of what's said here as the environmental impact of Oxford University's operations. But it was really focused in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity impacts. We carried that out, and then second report, so if you go forward one, please, was published the following year, and we carried out a follow-up assessment for the next year's impact. So that's for 2019-2020. And we're currently in the process of finishing the third such assessment. So what we're doing, which is quite nice, is creating a sequence of impact assessments for biodiversity and greenhouse gas emissions for the university as a whole, and going to be able to start tracing that through time. So how do we do that? The next slide is awful, but it's the next slide. That gives you a bit of an overview of the method that we used. And I'm sure many people on this call, certainly the other people talking, but maybe many people on the call too, will be familiar with some of the terms in here. Hopefully some of you will be. Maybe some people won't. But just to take you through this figure, we start with the scope on the left. This links obviously to what Johan was saying about the necessary scope, but really this points out that what we included with scope was research, education, and operational activities of the university. So it's not just the research and the education, but also the running of the university itself. And then you look across some of the data providers, and you can see that we spoke to estates and purchasing, human resources and student analytics and suppliers. There's a number of very important things that we didn't include within scope explicitly. And I think it's probably worth having a discussion as part of these webinars and further about what absolutely needs to be included in scope. For example, we took the decision not to include downstream impacts. So we included the supply chain, but we didn't include the downstream impacts. And the reason for that is we think it's particularly difficult for a university, which I can talk about in due course. So having defined the scope, we then move along to the aspects. These are just the main environmental aspects we considered. And these are the headings under which we collected all the available activity data that the university was able to provide for the year. We used a series of tools to convert the activity data. And by activity data, I mean, for example, the cost data taken from invoices, the kilowatt hours taken from energy bills, those kind of activity data. So the tools we used then converted all of those different activity data into our midpoint impacts. You can see we used a number of tools that some people might be familiar with, for example, implementing XEO-Base3 database in OpenLCA software. That's, for those who aren't familiar, life cycle assessment databases to understand the midpoint impacts of those different aspects of the university's operations. And then some of the other tools, we used the HESCET tool, which is for higher education carbon emissions estimations. So we use that to estimate some of the, well, particularly, for example, greenhouse gas emissions. And then finally, the FoodDB tool, which is an internal Oxford University tool for calculating the environmental impacts of food, which has since been updated in subsequent versions of this method that we're implementing. So using the series of tools, we were able to convert those activities into different environmental midpoint impacts. You can see there greenhouse gas emissions, land use, etc. And you can see the midpoint metrics we used to measure the impacts in each of those categories. And then finally, we were able to obviously aggregate all of the greenhouse gas emissions into an overall tons of CO2 equivalent estimate for the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the university's impacts, and use the recipe conversion factors to convert the other, well, all of the other midpoint metrics, midpoint values into estimates of biodiversity loss and species year. So happy to talk about any of that in more detail, but I only have 20 minutes, so I'm not going to dwell on any of this further. But as I say, happy to talk about it in more detail. And those reports should be available as well for people who really want to get stuck into the detail of the methods we used. So if we go to the next slide, please. A couple of things to point out. This is a large table, but I understand this is all being shared publicly afterwards, so people can reflect on this afterwards if they'd like, rather than try and read it all now. But I include this table here just to say that in the report that came out of the second impact assessment, that's led by Elizabeth Biggs, that's the one I referenced down at the bottom there. One of the things we're really keen to bring out was data gaps. So not only the key impact areas across the different environmental aspects, but also where the data gaps were and where the main impact sources were. Because that's kind of, for any of these applications, there's going to be huge data gaps for any organization. And one of the key elements of these assessments has to be saying, where are the data gaps? How important are these to our overall biodiversity impacts? And how important are they to our journey towards nature positive? So you can see for the different aspects there, we pulled out some of the key impact areas for interest. So for example, some things you might expect in travel, greenhouse gas emissions is one of the key impact areas. Look at something like food, and again, some might expect this, but land use is one of the key impact areas on the food side, and so forth. But then you can see down that third column there, the data gaps, and these are some of what we consider some of the really important data gaps when we carried out the assessment, such as frequency of international student flights. Food, you'll see in a minute, we found food to be one of the big sources of biodiversity impact from the university's operations, but a lot of the food that the food impacts we estimated are actually quite a small fraction of the overall food consumed by people associated with the university. It was only the food in the cafes on campus, which is actually quite a small amount of the food consumed. So that's a substantial data gap. And then other various data gaps in the different environmental aspects. Again, I don't put this here so everyone will have a full detailed view of all these aspects. It's more just to highlight that we thought it was important to systematically go through and make sure data gaps are recognised and talked about in detail. You can see then for each of those aspects, we start to pull together some of the main recommendations we made. And the recommendations we made were structured, as Johan suggested, and as the B&B platform suggests, through the conservation mitigation hierarchy type approach, where you're focusing on avoidance and minimization of impacts in the first place, followed by remediation and offset measures if for any residual impacts. So you can see that in that column there, we've pulled out some of the key recommendations about how to mitigate those different impacts and what that involves, whether that's an avoidance measure or an offset measure or something else. So if we go to the next slide, please. So this is now this figure is now pulled out of we wrote a short analysis paper in Nature, which was published just this year, which maybe some people have read, hopefully. And this figure is pulled out of that. What this figure shows, first of all, is the impact, the proportional biodiversity impacts of those different environmental aspects that I just talked about in the method. So if you look down the left there, you can see built environment, food, and so forth. Some of the different aspects of Oxford's activities, they're the main categories we used. And then if you look at down the first column, that's the direct, and the second is the indirect representation of the impacts. So by direct and indirect, we're just talking about those, first of all, that are directly within Oxford's control, and secondly, those that are indirectly influenceable by the university. So for instance, the management of buildings is a direct impact that can be managed by Oxford itself, arguably, whereas indirect built environment impacts might link to construction materials and the impacts in the supply chain of those construction materials, which can be influenced by Oxford but aren't directly within its control. So you can see there that we've got those two columns. One of the key things here as well then is the relative size of these different circles. The size of the circle is obviously linked to the relative impact. And this is not schematic, this is quantitative based on the actual data that and the actual analytical outcomes of our assessment, measured, as I say, basically in local relative species loss for each impact category based on the life cycle assessment literature. So but the metric is less important than the fact that we have a way of comparing the relative size of biodiversity impact across these different areas of Oxford's activities. A couple of things to pull out. First of all, you might expect that there's substantial impacts associated with built environment and travel. That's probably not a huge surprise. But one thing that is important is the relative impacts of food on the relative biodiversity impacts of food, particularly in the supply chain. Indirectly, you can see there. When we did the similar analysis for greenhouse gas emissions, and food impacts in terms of emissions were much smaller, relatively speaking, compared to the other aspects than food impacts on biodiversity. So that was one important thing to point out. Another important thing to point out was then the enormous relative impacts caused by the resource use aspect. And that's all linked to embodied biodiversity impacts in the supply chain. And in particular, one thing that was interesting was that research laboratory equipment at the University of Oxford is one of the huge contributors, the leading contributor to the biodiversity impacts in the supply chain. So obviously that's extremely important, because Oxford, is in part, its identity is its research laboratories, right, amongst other things. You can't just avoid the impacts entirely of research laboratories, or you'd have no Oxford. Similarly, you can make the argument that that's mission critical and unavoidable impacts because of the good to society that some of those research activities provide. For instance, we saw a leap in laboratory equipment linked to clinical research during the second year of the analysis, because obviously that was very closely matched to the COVID pandemic and the combination of the research done into vaccines, but also the work done on testing and so forth. So a lot of those impacts that are overwhelmingly large in those indirect impacts for resource use are linked with research laboratories, and it's very clear that you can't really avoid those impacts without losing a big part of what makes Oxford University Oxford. So this speaks to Johann's point about this idea of transformation. To reach nature positive, to overcome and mitigate these kind of impacts, we're going to have to accept some degree of transformation of organizations, and it's the key thing is going to be where that's going to have to be. Next slide, please. Well, next image, thank you. So, having assessed the biodiversity impacts of Oxford's activities, which has to be the starting point, we then, as I said, start to look at some different options for going from those annual impacts on biodiversity to actually, in this case, no net loss. So the bare minimum to get towards nature positive is to at least get to no net loss, right? And what you can see here in these two bar graphs is two different optional scenarios in which we, again, based on the actual data that we had, in which we say, well, we know the size of that overall bar is the overall biodiversity impacts for 1 year. How do we reduce those down to and mitigate those down to zero, basically? And the option one on the left there, you can see, is what we call a heavy avoidance strategy, where in orange, you're avoiding a big chunk, just over a third of the impacts. And that's by, for example, stopping the sale of certain things, preventing the use of any paper, halting construction, preventing flights. It's quite a deep cut to get that level of avoidance of biodiversity impacts. The light blue is the minimization measures under the mitigation hierarchy, where you're doing, for example, a halving of utilities consumption and IT use. You're requiring certain constraints on staff travel. So that's minimizing some of the biodiversity impacts. You then, because you're Oxford University, have a lot of land available to do some of your own ecological restoration. But one of the interesting things here is that even though Oxford University owns a huge amount of land, the university itself, much less so than the colleges, they're still even restoring all of that green space that you have available to kind of more biodiversity-rich green space. Only takes you a very small way towards no net loss or nature positive. So then finally, even in the heavy avoidance strategy option that we have there, you still have to purchase biodiversity offsets to deal with at least roughly a third of your biodiversity impacts annually. That's then contrasted against our second option there, which is more of a heavy offset approach, where you do very few avoidance measures, a little bit of minimization of impacts there. You can see in the top, the orange and the light blue. You still restore all the land, but you focus on purchasing loads of biodiversity offsets domestically and internationally in order to compensate for your residual biodiversity impacts as a way of getting towards no net loss. And we start to explore what that might actually look like if you're essentially compensating for at least 3/4 of your biodiversity impacts to get towards no net loss. And it's, well, expensive, challenging, requires you to know where in your supply chain your biodiversity impacts are in order to do it properly, we would argue, and to do it in an affordable way. But also, actually, this option 2 is probably the closer one to the current Oxford University environmental sustainability strategy. So we really are now exploring how to move that more towards the avoidance approach, which clearly needs to be a part of the solution. And next slide, please. So as I say, just to point out, this was all published in this article in Nature, which provides not only a nice overview of the work we did and the strategies towards no net loss/net gain for biodiversity, but also links in the supplementary materials to the reports that I mentioned, which give a really detailed approach for how we did the biodiversity impact calculations in the first place. And the other reason I flashed this on the slide is just to say that having published this, one of our key motivations for publishing this paper and publishing all the data and our analyses was to basically draw a line in the sand and say, here's a large organization, and Oxford University is a very large organization. Here's a large organization actually being disclosing its biodiversity impacts and the way those were measured in a way that's much more extensive than I think had been done really many times before. So the idea was to publish it in as high profile a way as possible and say, here's how Oxford's done it. Hopefully allowing other people, other organizations to kind of join the public disclosure in a more. And I've realized that some organizations have already published their biodiversity impact, but to keep kind of trying to push the boundary of how deep we can publish and how extensively we can publish the outcomes of these kind of biodiversity impact and net gain type strategy assessments. So next slide, please. Another thing to say with this is that as a result, we've set up, well, I say we, I haven't, but other people have. The University of Oxford, along with the UN Environment Programme and others, have set up what's called the Nature Positive Universities Alliance. And the idea there is that a whole set of universities from across the world also pledge a kind of net gain or nature positive type goal, and that those universities then work together, sharing data, sharing tools, sharing methods, sharing strategies for going from current impacts towards nature positive, and also potentially share opportunities for restoration and biodiversity offset opportunities in different parts of the world. So that's the idea behind that Nature Positive Universities Alliance. It's led out of Oxford by my colleague Emily Stott. And one of the reasons I mentioned this is not only because I think it's I think it's an encouraging initiative, but also because I think it points to the fact we need systemic change, really. It's going to be very hard for one organization by itself to become nature positive. It's only really going to be possible, I think, with systemic change from across a sector or across an industry, from a load of different organizations working together and working across different value chains as well. Next slide, please. All right, now I come to the grid that was given to us by our colleagues. I realize I've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'll be brief. But actually, I've cheated slightly with this because what I didn't want to do was represent. That's okay, thank you. Thanks. What I didn't want to do was give really detailed idea of whether I thought that University of Oxford was going to meet the nature positive in the different areas of operations, because I don't think, well, it's not really for me to say as a researcher and as one of the people who carried out the assessment. But I think it gives an opportunity to talk in general how I think this grid helps us. So if we go along one, as I said, the first point is that Oxford University's biodiversity commitment is biodiversity net gain, which is not explicitly a nature positive objective. I think nature positive is a more ambitious goal. And again, I'm happy to talk afterwards if people are interested in why I think that. But I think it's important that we make that distinction. Also, it's a biodiversity net gain target. It's not a nature net gain target. It's not a nature positive target. And biodiversity is a specific subcomponent of nature, as Johan pointed out. If we go to the next slide, just to point that then obviously there's the climate related target for Oxford, which is the net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Now I put those both in green because I think they're eminently feasible. I think given the different ways that biodiversity net gain can be measured and monitored, I think it's possible to move towards biodiversity net gain over a given time period and net zero greenhouse gas emissions. I think those are achievable goals. But if we go to the next slide, obviously nature positive is about then combining all of those different environmental issues together into kind of an integrated nature positive goal. And that's where I think it starts to get a lot more challenging. I'm not saying it's not achievable, but it starts to get a lot more challenging, considering issues like water and land and soil. Well, land use has to be included in considerations of biodiversity and climate. That has to be done. But I think the water and soil particularly gets quite challenging. So next, if you go along one more, please. I just looked at these three different columns and wanted to consider in general how achievable they are for an organization like a university. I think in the supply chain side, it's possible to understand supply chain impacts. It's possible because you're a large organization and one with quite a high and relatively visible brand to exert influence on supply chains. It's possible to be selective about supply chains. So I think it's achievable to think about nature positive on that side of the value chain. If we go to the next slide, I think Direct operations is eminently possible and achievable to look towards nature positive, particularly if you have an organisation with a large land holding, so it can actually do that and do some restoration on site. But that's not necessarily going to be everything that's required to get towards nature positive. But then I think if you go to the next slide, downstream is very, very challenging for a university particularly, and that's partly because, you know, at what point do you draw the line and stop including the impacts of different research outcomes, just different technologies that are developed, different heads of state that are educated at Oxford was one thing we discussed. You know, the downstream impacts of a knowledge-based and research-based organisation is very hard to quantify, just like it is for, well, almost any organisation, I think, that's not directly, for example, consumer products. So if we go along, Johan, can you nod if I have another minute to finish up, or should I stop now? 1 more minute. Okay, thank you. So some brief reflections. If you just go along, please. Is nature positive possible? Next point. Yes, but only with a complete overhaul of business as usual. Serious transformation will be needed, and that's something we see across all the organisations we're now working on nature positive with. The second question, is a journey towards nature positive acceptable? The kind of ratcheted approach. My thought is yes, possibly, but I do worry, honestly, that it risks the credibility of the whole approach, and I think that's an important point for discussion, as I'm sure Johan would agree. Then a few criteria points. The scope, I think there's a real challenge in looking at the whole value chain for some organisations, universities being a really good example of that. I think the next point I would say is that the baseline is super important, and it has to be a fixed baseline for nature positive. And the third of the criteria to pick up is implementation. It's critical, but really poorly supported role of avoidance measures. We need to get a much better handle on avoidance measures, or none of this is ever going to work, frankly. So if we go then, I think that should take me to my final slide. Yes, it does. Thank you very much for listening. Sorry if I ran over by a minute, and I look forward to the other talks.
No, thanks a lot, Joe. That was really a great presentation. It was a presentation. Well, I read the paper, and I thought this is really a great example because it provides quantitative underpinning of the positive and the negative impacts, and that's really what we want to see in practice. Also, the options on transformation are really fantastic. It really shows how difficult it is to implement substantial transformation. It's very easy said that you need to transform your business model and so on, but you immediately, it's quite easy to jump to offset measures, and then it's a very controversial issue. So thank you. Lots of inspirational ideas. Much appreciated. So now it's my pleasure to introduce you to Katie Fensom. Katie is a sustainable value chains lead within the Biodiversity Consultancy, and she took over from Burberry's, who, as I said in the beginning, has declined at the very last moment. And Katie will bring some experiences from the work that the Biodiversity Consultancy is doing in relation to nature positive. Katie.
Thanks very much, Johan. As Johan said, I'm from the Biodiversity Consultancy. We work with a lot of companies on their biodiversity strategy specifically, but also set within a nature positive framework, which a lot of companies are finding quite helpful and inspirational to think through. I can't walk through in sort of a more technical or quantified way on examples from our clients, but what we thought we'd do, as Johan mentioned, it's fairly short notice, but what we thought we'd do is share a few of the principles that we talk through with clients and think through with our clients, and share some anonymized examples at the end using the framework that Johan shared. So if you don't mind going to the next slide, that would be very helpful. Thanks. So at TPC, we work with quite a few different organisations on some of these concepts that are going around with nature positive and science-based targets for nature. And I think what companies really are looking for is very specific guidance on exactly how to set quantified targets across the range of different elements of nature, across the different elements of the supply chain, which is really quite an ambitious challenge, given like basically a world's worth of complexity of all the different business types and all the different supply chain nodes that you have in your system. So while the SBTN they've set themselves the task of taking that on, and it's an extremely ambitious task. They focused on a subset of the realms of nature and the nodes of the supply chain that they'll deliver guidance on at the end of 2023, with full guidance aiming to come out in 2025. Next slide, please. So at the moment, companies can pilot some methods that are available there to work towards nature positive goals on water quantity, water quality, which at the moment focuses on a subset of nutrient and pollutants. And it focuses on upstream and direct operations. At the moment, there are no guidance on downstream operations, partly because of what Joe just outlined, that the world of downstream operations, what the scope of that is, where you set the line in the sand and how you measure impacts, it's not yet defined. So at the moment, there isn't guidance on there. And later in the year, there will be some guidance on setting land-based targets, and an announcement will be made on biodiversity as well, and how that will fit with all of these elements within nature. Next slide, please. However, while there is no absolute defined concept of what nature positive is, the global biodiversity framework within the UN CBD is providing that, but the actual goals will be released later as they discuss them. There are some concepts that that there's consensus around, which Johan outlined himself as well. So one of these is that it should capture a broad concept of nature, not just biodiversity, not just carbon, but also oceans, land, and fresh water. It should have a strong emphasis on halting nature loss from a 2020 baseline, and ideally sooner if possible. For example, the palm oil sector has 2015 as their baseline for no deforestation. And it also means a meaningful nature recovery, so more nature in the world than there currently is, and especially turning it back so any ongoing losses that we experience from 2020 are offset. And maybe offset is not the favoured term, but like there's beneficial gains made in time for 2030. And also that these should happen in a safe and just way, that it benefits the communities who are impacted by the activities as much as it benefits nature. So those are the core principles. And in terms of what it means for business, it means, as Johan mentioned, setting targets and taking action on all material aspects of your supply chain. So within the SBTN framework, that often means conducting a materiality assessment that looks at the different pressures on nature along different nodes of the supply chain, and where they come out as high priority, setting targets and taking action within those. It means taking near-term actions to avoid any further losses as soon as possible, and following the steps of the mitigation hierarchy, which I won't go into detail on because I think that's been really well expounded in the last couple of presentations. And obviously it means measurable, time-bound and actionable targets, which many of you will be familiar with. Those are obviously important, but also quite challenging when it involves so many actors. So for example, zero deforestation by 2020 was a measurable, time-bound and actionable target. And it's ambitious. Matching ambition with actionable is always a challenge. And I'll walk through some ways that you can address that in complex supply chains in a bit. So just as a note, if you don't mind moving to the next slide, please, Julian. When I'm talking about this, like we have clients at TPC across lots of different sectors, but often the people expressing interest in nature positive, and many of our clients are downstream clients. So I'm often going to come at this topic from a downstream perspective. So a brand, for example, who's purchasing a lot of materials from the agricultural supply chains and are sending those off into their customer base. So if we combine those principles with that curve that's come out of the Global Goal for Nature, what this means in terms of a structured set of targets is a strong focus on avoidance of new impacts from the 2020 baseline, if not earlier, reducing ongoing impacts. So what that means is anything that you currently have a footprint on and the impacts that happen within that, reduce the impact on nature that exists there. So an example might be if you're sourcing from a farm for your wool that you're buying, there's going to be an impact on biodiversity there. There's going to be a certain loss of the species on farm. So do what you can to reduce the impact in that production area. So that might mean bringing back in some semi-natural habitat or reducing the toxicity of the inputs in the area. It also means regenerating working ecosystems to stabilize use. So that means, regenerative agricultural practices, for example, to increase soil biodiversity and soil carbon sequestration. And it means transforming the system, which again, that's been touched upon today. And it's a very thorny issue, but a critical one to making sure that we actually meet these global goals together. And then taking positive actions to protect and restore existing impacts. And these points, they do follow the mitigation hierarchy, with positive actions to protect and restore coming finally, because whilst that's a critical part and you can get started on that right now, it shouldn't be a matter of, okay, well, we have this footprint on nature and we're just going to go buy some land and do something. That's a really important part, but it's very important that you first avoid any future losses. Otherwise, we won't meet our nature and climate commitments. Next slide, please. So a bit more detail on what avoidance of new impacts might be. This is obviously easiest for your own operations. You can more easily make decisions about where you will or will not build, and in that set and implement zero deforestation targets. But it also applies to the production base, which is where the biggest risks for habitat conversion are. There are three components of no conversion. There's zero deforestation, which has been the large focus of the business community until now, which is because forests harbour, I think, about 80% of the planet's biodiversity. So they are really critical, and obviously they're massive carbon stocks too. However, we are finding more and more about the importance of other habitats for both carbon and biodiversity. So the picture here is a seagrass habitat, which also harbour high amounts of carbon and high amounts of biodiversity, and are impacted by certain industries. And also avoidance of impacts on priority biodiversity areas. So that might be protected areas, some of which aren't fully protected, but also areas that have high species abundance or high species richness. So these are obviously targets that so many companies have set, but it needs to go beyond just a headline target. Ways that you can make sure that you're implementing that are obviously, if it's a new thing for you, if you're not like, you know, in the palm oil sector and have made commitments a while ago around no deforestation or other deforestation risk commodities that are well known, there are other materials that also are being found to be associated with deforestation. For example, cattle and sheep in Eastern Australia is increasingly being highlighted as a risk, as well as pig farming in Mexico. And there are other frontiers emerging all the time, and WWF and GFW keep a good watch on that. There are ways that you can investigate where your production base might be and your highest risks are. And in those supply chain materials and supply chain points, it's important as well to consider time-bound actionable targets in those regions and points. Certification, just quickly to wrap up on that one, certification can get you some way towards a zero deforestation target, but it really depends on the criteria that you have in the certification system that you use. And also there's increasing pressure from the world of environmental campaigning that mass balance is excellent. For those of you familiar with certification, mass balance is excellent. It's a really important way of making sure that some of the area is protected and managed in sustainable ways. But if you are purchasing mass balance, you're still exposed to frontiers of deforestation potentially in that material, and companies are increasingly being asked to go beyond and do things where that material that they purchase is contributing to forest loss. So next slide, please. Thanks. And then reducing ongoing impact. So this means, as I said, it's the places where you're currently purchasing or having activities. You need to reduce that in order to bend that curve back upwards by 2030. And obviously that point, as I think it's been mentioned already, it might move a few years into the future, especially with like the problems that we've been having as a planet recently. And it might go up or down in terms of ambition. But the point is, whatever the impact is right now on a 2020 baseline, we need to be better than that at 2030. And that's essentially what Nature Positive is about. So in order to bend that curve upwards, we need to stop having increasingly negative impacts and bring it back up, which means improving or reducing the impacts that you have in your existing system. The photo there represents a wind farm, which obviously is not a downstream company, which I'm most familiar with working with. But we work a lot with renewable energy companies, and some of the things that they're looking into is having a baseline of the impacts that they have on species at site in 2020 and trying to reduce that. So, for example, looking at the baseline of the number of animals that might unfortunately experience mortality, which is an aspect of renewable energy, but we need to take steps towards a carbon-free economy. Okay, next slide, thanks. So transforming the system, this takes multiple elements. And I really like the recent paper. I don't know if people are familiar with it, but there was a recent publication on Nature Positive that came out from, I think, a mixture of Oxford University, some of our staff at TBC, that talks about what it means to be nature positive and how people are thinking about this. And they talk about the horizontal versus the vertical integration of this thinking and the work that you need to do. The vertical is kind of the sucking up, positive actions through your supply chain or taking action within your supply chain to move towards nature positive, whereas the vertical is the transforming across the industry or across the sector or across sectors to make sure that multiple people are taking action and setting the standard for what's expected. So that's sector transformation is basically essential, because otherwise there's a risk of leakage or bifurcation of the market, where some companies, standing in isolation, they say, okay, I'm going to buy only certified material. I'm going to chop out this region because it's a deforestation region, and I'm going to, conserve this amount of habitat, and maybe can make claims towards working towards nature positive. But unfortunately, that's not going to change the system as a whole. It's really important to be setting the standard and bringing everyone up together. So building capacity amongst your suppliers, working in a pre-competitive way with peers within and beyond your sector are also critical elements. Landscape transformation is about, on the ground programs to avoid conversion and minimize impacts on biodiversity in a landscape, working across multiple sectors. The reason that transformation is necessary there is because it addresses so many things and brings in so many elements of what it is to be human and work as a farmer. It's a challenging thing, but it needs to be done to make sure that people are benefiting as much as nature. And then business transformation is obviously the more of the commercial side, is integrating the principles of being nature positive across the levels of the organization and making sure that it's taken into consideration with procurement, and there's a due diligence approach taken to further choices that the business makes. Next slide, please. And then positive contribution. So once you've taken all of those steps, having a positive contribution is a really important bit. So to protect and restore habitat, we're not going to be able to get above our current line without restoration activities and doing something positive towards nature. We're working with companies to understand what the scale of their impact is right now, and so therefore what a proportionate contribution towards the CBD level goals might be. We're also thinking through what capacity, how capacity affects what those targets might look like. If you are a downstream company, building capacity in the production base where some of the most key issues is critical. And obviously context and working with people and making sure that there are benefits to people too is really important aspect. Next slide, please. So I took this table from Johan, and I've filled this out from the perspective of not exactly a fictional client, but multiple things that I'm seeing within our client base of the actions that they're taking, and try to highlight it about in the color scheme of how much can we go towards these things. I really take Joe's point about downstream and the line needing to be set. I think we can set that line. Hopefully not all of us are responsible, not many of us are responsible for future leaders of the world. So that's a good thing. I'm glad I don't have to deal with that kind of thinking. But downstream is the area that I think least thought has gone, and there are very few tools to predict where the impacts might be and how to reduce them. So the activities that I'm seeing amongst clients is things like reducing or setting zero single-use plastic targets, and using encouraging customers to change their behavior as well in terms of length of use of the object that they might have purchased, or to wash it less often, or to use different chemicals. You're increasingly seeing tags going out with items that you purchase advising on how to use items, and that's often because when companies have done these materialities, they've found that their main impacts are not their own, they're downstream or upstream in the case of people who are connected to agricultural materials or mining often. For direct operations, I think it is achievable. There are many clients who've made really ambitious climate science-based targets and have achieved them, and significantly reduced water and effluents of toxic waste. And then for biodiversity, it really depends on the sector. Some sectors are looking at their own biodiversity impact at their own sites, but when you're talking about sort of offices and retail, it's comparatively small. So it's not considered material, but then a lot of people want to show that they're doing something on site to kind of set an example, which I think is a really good movement of the of ESG. Then for the supply chain, I've split that into producers and then mid-tiers, because if you are a downstream company, those two things are completely different, producers versus processors. In the world of carbon, it tends to, focus people's minds on tier one suppliers and then ask them maybe to set their own targets for their upstream for anyone that comes beyond the tier one suppliers. But for carbon, that's only measurable within proxy indicators of whether they have their own targets rather than if they've actually met them. But nevertheless, there is progress being made there, and especially with water and chemicals, there's in many sectors there's amazing progress being made by some companies. And again, terrestrial impacts have been highlighted as less material because these midstream are also based in urban areas often, but water and chemical use and carbon are highly important. Then moving on to production. Again, it really depends on the sector about how much advancement people are making into these areas, but there are actions that are going to facilitate moving towards a nature positive world. One of them is nature-based solutions, working with farmers on the ground to protect forests or restore forests, work with their soils to improve. And then working with certified volumes with the caveats that I mentioned, like certified volumes are excellent, but ideally to scale that up. So you're not just sort of isolated yourself as like, I'm going to buy the certified material, but not contribute positively. That will hopefully be a focus moving forward. And then for biodiversity, there are tools out there to quantify your impacts on biodiversity on the ground, but not necessarily ones that are immediately translatable to baselines, for example, for monitoring biodiversity in the future. But yeah, there are lots of actions being taken in the fashion sector, for example. There's a huge focus on regenerative agriculture, which is important for climate, biodiversity, and soil. And I can see I'm running out of time, so I'll hop to the next slide. Is there time?
Yeah, almost. You can do the last slide, Katie.
Okay, so in this one, because that was a huge a bunch of information, that was really just a don't want to say the word brain dump, but it's out there now, of things that we're seeing with our with the different sectors we work in. This one sort of highlights, I think, some of the key challenges. So just to mention, what I think we've seen so far, especially at supply chain in the mid-tier, is a focus on reduction and not a focus on positive contribution. And I think that will be the next thing that needs to happen as part of transformation, is to really build the capacity of mid-tier so that they take on board the ambition and responsibility to make a positive contribution to really have their own targets, to take action, to collaborate with the brand or the buyer to take action on the ground, for example. I think that's critical. Just to pull out another point is that traceability hasn't been mentioned today, which is unusual. Traceability usually gets pulled up as we don't have traceability and we need traceability. Traceability is really important, but you absolutely can do things without traceability. There are tons of things that predict where materials are being produced and where issues are. And if you can work in a pre-competitive way to tackle those issues, traceability can come next. And I really think we're going to start to see a dual approach where people are working around their supply chains where the issues are, and then also through certifications and things that kind of happen within the supply chain, and then eventually merge them once, different areas have been addressed in terms of their issues, rather than not being able to do anything until you can say that this is specifically in my supply chain. But building trust and pre-competitive collaboration is essential for that, and that's part of the transformation pillar. Yeah, and I'll end it there. Thanks very much, Johan.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Katie. Fantastic, a really good presentation. I think it's interesting to make this differentiation inside the supply chain between producers and other actors in the supply chain. This is you're the first one who is doing this. also your thoughts on downstream, and they resonate with the thoughts of Joe Bell. And downstream is indeed the most complicated. In other webinars, previous webinars, we had people relying on life cycle analysis. In fact, Joe, you also rely on life cycle analysis, and then you would think downstream is included. So that's worth another discussion, maybe. Just to reflect very quickly on a question in the chat, everything will be shared on the website of the platform, and I think also people will receive the presentation soon after this webinar. So you'll have everything very soon, and everything is accessible afterwards. So thanks again, Katie. Now we move to the last speaker of today, which is Alexandra Silva. She's a chair of the Biodiversity Technical Working Group of CEM Bureau, which is the European Cement Federation. And CEM Bureau was invited because they have a nature positive roadmap, a nature positive agenda. So I am happy to invite you, Alexandra, to present your specific case.
Thank you, Johan, and good afternoon to all. So as Johan said, I'm the chair of the task force of CEM Bureau. However, I have a day job. I work for a cement company, a Portuguese one, Cecil, and I've been working with Quarry, Rehabilitation and Biodiversity within the cement company since 2005. So next slide, please. So before we start presenting the Biodiversity Roadmap of CEM Bureau, just one slide about CEM Bureau. So CEM Bureau is the European Cement Association. We have around 30 members, 27 full members and 3 associate members. And maybe mostly these full members are national cement industry associations and also cement companies from the European Union. So like Cecil, I represent also the National Portuguese Association. So next slide, please. So the goal for this case study is also to provide an overview of the Biodiversity Roadmap, and the roadmap was officially launched on 1 June of this year and was during an event of the European Green Week in the beginning of June. So my goal for you is to present our vision, how we manage biodiversity in and around quarries over the next coming decades. So next slide, please. So our ambition with this roadmap is to contribute to the halting biodiversity loss during the life cycle of a quarry, and especially throughout the rehabilitation process. And our actions and targets within this roadmap aim to contribute to several initiatives. So mainly the Sustainable Development Goal 15, Life on Lands, the Decade Ecosystem Restoration proclaimed by the United Nations, the directives Habitats and Birds from the European Union, the Pollinator Initiatives, the biodiversity strategy that defined targets until 2030, and the regulation on invasive alien species. So I could say that these regulations and initiatives were the basis for defining the actions and targets of our roadmap. Next slide, please. So in publish this roadmap, and it's available on CEM Bureau website, you can download the document. We are sharing our vision for biodiversity in the coming decades. And this outlines actions and targets until 2030, and they are grouped in 4 focus areas. So this roadmap is a tool to help guide and influence companies to manage biodiversity, especially in quarries, and also inspire collaboration between the cement sector and so with other stakeholders, such as regulators, nature conservation association, consultants, policy institutions, and of course, mainly academia. And as Johan said in the beginning, our goal with this roadmap is also to contribute to the global goal of nature positive. And how can we do that? We can do that by enhancing the ecological values of our quarries and mainly throughout the process of rehabilitation. So next slide, please. So the scope of this roadmap is focused on limestone quarries that provide the raw materials for the production of cement. However, we encourage companies, CEM Bureau members, to extend the application of this roadmap actions and targets to other extractive sectors and process. So it's up to each company to decide whether to extend the scope of this roadmap to include, for example, aggregate quarries. So just to give you an overview about the structure of the roadmap, we have 4 focus areas. As I said, we have a small introduction and also a vision of what we want to achieve for each focus area. And of course, our actions and targets until 2030. And we also develop some KPIs to measure the implementation of the roadmap regarding our members. So next slide, please. So as I said, the roadmap outlines actions and targets until 2030, and they are grouped in 4 focus areas. So ecosystem rehabilitation and ecosystem service are the first one. The second is pollinator initiative from the European Union. The third, invasive species. We only focus actions for plants. And the last one is protected species. So in the following slides, I will give you an overview of what we intend to develop for each focus area. So next slide, please. So what is your vision for ecosystem rehabilitation and ecosystem service? So this is very linked to the restoration targets from the European Biodiversity Strategy and also to the United Nations Decades of Ecosystem Restoration. So within this focus area, we want to promote progress core rehabilitation. It's very important, the word progress here, because progressive rehabilitation means that rehabilitation is done in continuity at the pace of quarry extraction. And also this allows to reduce the open areas within the quarry and also to promote the development of habitats at an early stage and of the whole quarry life cycle. Also, it's very important working together with NGOs and academia. We have several examples of companies working with several researchers from several universities, and it's important to promote scientific knowledge and applied research on the rehabilitation project. So I normally say that science is our ally. It's not easy to restore quarries, so we need the scientific knowledge, and we need also academia to work with us to improve our restoration. Next slide, please. So the first target within this focus area is members need to report the actors rehabilitated by categories. So we defined several categories for habitats, for example, grassland, wetlands, ponds, nature forest using native species, and members will report these KPIs, this data annually. Next slide, please. So here you have a type of a chart with the type of rehabilitation of 4 limestone quarries of Sembiro members. So these are some examples that they already reported. And you can see that the category that is higher reported is natural forest. So members only use native species in the process of rehabilitation. You can download in the Sembiro site more information about these KPIs. Next slide, please. So the second target, and it's very important, it's linked to the quality of quarry restoration. So one of the things that this tool it needs to provide is encouraging sharing of knowledge among the members within quarry rehabilitation. And normally, as we said, we only manage what we measure, and was talked about it during the presentation here. We need to incorporate impact assessment methodology into the rehabilitation plans. So in the roadmap, we promote 2. One is from the Cement Sustainability Initiative that is part of the WCSD. It's a tool for measure the impact assessment in quarry rehabilitation, especially for cement quarries. But we also provide another tool that is the Biodiversity Indicator and Reporting System by IUCN. It calls BEARS, and also you can use this tool for measuring your impact using, for example, for cement quarries and also for aggregate quarries. Also, we want to increase our number of studies on ecosystem service provided by quarry rehabilitation. And what we mean by ecosystem service, for example, carbon sequestration provided by our work on rehabilitation, seed dispersal, pollination, and also culture values. So we want to increase these studies and also enhance quarry rehabilitation of non-ecosystems, non-forest ecosystem, for example, creating wetlands, creating habitats for pioneer species, and also creating habitats of grassland. And most important to us is the creation of temporary habitats in active quarries. This concept is very important for us. Next slide, please. So temporary habitats. So Sembiro has an internal definition for temporary habitats, and just a note, this definition could vary across country. This concept is recognized in a few member states like Germany and France. And also in these member states, the definition of temporary habits could vary. So for us, temporary habitats are areas which have been extracted but not yet rehabilitated and left untouched for at least 1 year within the active quarry area. So an active quarry area is an area that is currently under extraction, but it's already open for extraction, but the plan is to continue to extract, so it's not an area that does not have yet rehabilitation. Next slide, please. So here I want to show you an example of what is a temporary habitat within an active quarry. So why it's important for us. Temporary habitats capture biodiversity that has been created without rehabilitation, and this during the active quarry site. And this is a temporary pond in the quarry. This is used by amphibians, mainly in the spring, in different cycle stages. And here you can see some pictures of the buff calamita that uses this pond in the active quarry in the different life cycles. Next slide, please. So pollinators have been chosen as a second key focus area in this roadmap. The ecosystem service that this group of species provide, which is of course pollination, as an important economic value. And you probably are aware of course, that population of many pollinators are in decline. So we think that we can contribute with this roadmap to reversing the decline of wild pollinators across Europe. And how can we do that? Basically, members can take actions to support the conservation and rehabilitation of wild pollinators, and especially to get better understanding what species of pollinators occur in our quarries. So next slide, please. So the first target, it's related to knowledge. We want to create a database of wild pollinators that are inhabit our quarries, and we want to encourage companies to submit these records. And this could be done by routine service or initiatives with local communities, for example. And compiling this database is this information, what type of species occur in our quarries. We also can communicate to the European Pollinator Initiative. So this is our first target. So the second target, next slide, please. So the second target related to rehabilitation activities is specially linked to promote the interaction between vegetation and pollinators. So we want to encourage members to undertake several activities target specific for this group, that is this group of species. And these activities could be, for example, promotion of nectar pollen and rich habitats in the active site of the quarry, or creation of species-rich grasslands, for example, during the rehabilitation activities, also promoting of nesting and overwintering habitats for wild pollinators, and also creation of ponds with shallow white edges, but also within the rehabilitation activities or within the active sites. Next slide, please. So here, just to present you a case study. So this is the type of case study that we want to promote in this roadmap. This is the case study that compare plant pollinator networks in two quarries, one with progress rehabilitation, another with spontaneous restoration, and compare with the natural reference area. I don't have time to highlight all the results, but you have a link here in the slide, and the paper is available online. But just to point out a result that the restored and natural areas follow the same model, which suggests that the pollination service in the restored quarry is effective. So this is one of the conclusions of the case study. So next slide, please. So the third focus area is linked to the European regulation of invasive species, and invasive species represent a major threat to native species in Europe. And because quarries can provide conditions for the establishment of invasive species, we decide to include this as a focus area. So again, knowledge is very important, and we want to facilitate the sharing of experience within the cement sector, and also provide knowledge and tools for members to manage relevant invasive plant species in their quarries. Next slide, please. So the first target is to develop a database of invasive alien species that occur in our quarries, in our members, that are most significant for the cement sector. And based on this database, we want to share appropriate materials and tools to support members on managing invasive alien species. Next slide, please. So based on the database that we will build regarding invasive alien species, we want members to implement an invasive alien plant species management plan or a strategy across relevant sites. And what we mean by relevant sites where exists an impact from invasive species in Europe. And note that in the roadmap, we promote natural methods for the control of invasive species. So we recommend that any herbicide should not be used in the actions to control invasive alien species. So next slide, please. So finally, the fourth focus area that is protected species and is linked to the European Union Habitats and Bird Directive. So we want to continue to promote good practice and legal compliance with these directives. You will find in the SEMBIRO website several case studies from members highlighting this good practice related to protected species. And one of the things that we want is members to implement tools designed to protect species. Two examples, a biodiversity management plan and also the code of conduct for the extractive sector. This code of conduct was published last year, I think in October, and was a partnership between Heidelberg Cement, BirdLife Europe, SEMBIRO, Gypsum, and UPG, that is the European Association for the Aggregate Sectors. Next slide, please. So the first target is to support members throughout knowledge and guidance in the implementation of a biodiversity management plan for sites, especially with high biodiversity value, and also to identify simple, effective measures to protect and especially also enhance population of protected species that are more common and found in our quarries. So this is our first target. Our second target, next slide, please. So our second target is related to protected species enhancement. So we want to develop case studies to improve the regional or local status of protected species. And here for this second target is very important. And I think this is throughout the whole roadmap. It's important to develop partnerships, namely with academia or other partners to conduct specific assessments, implement specific conservation responses or measure, and especially monitoring this type of protected species that are more important or conservation concern within the company and within the quarry areas. So next slide. So we identify, as I said in the beginning, we identify a set of indicators in order to measure the implementation of the roadmap. I won't describe all of them, but just to point out that each target in each focus area, we have one or more KPIs to measure the progress on the roadmap. And this will all be our next work within the task force. We will prepare a plan to measure the implementation of the roadmap. So we are getting to the two slides. So related to the key questions about the relation to this net positive impact, can my company, in this case my sector, be nature positive? Is possible. So SEMBIRO already published a carbon neutrality roadmap. They want to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, and also the SEMBIRO Biodiversity Roadmap that I present here today. So related to the second question, and as I said at the beginning of the presentation, the Biodiversity Roadmap aims to contribute to the global goal of nature positive by enhancing the ecological values of our quarry, and true, especially for the process of rehabilitation. But however, we do not aim to be nature positive by 2030. We need to be honest. So regarding the matrix, next slide. So regarding to respond to this matrix, our approach of the cement sector on our journey towards nature positive. Regarding the supply chain, we classify as maybe we don't have direct control regarding climate, water, biodiversity in the upstream of the supply chain. However, in the direct operation in downstreams, it's different. So regarding climate in direct operation, as I said, SEMBIRO published the carbon neutrality roadmap. This includes all direct operation and also the activities in the downstream of the value chain. And by 2030, the roadmap proposed to reduce around 40% of the CO2 emissions per ton of cement using the 1990 baseline. Regarding water, the impact of the cement industry in water, mainly, especially in direct operations, is low. However, we need further analysis to give you an actual response and an actual evaluation. So we classify this maybe. And regarding to biodiversity, as I said, we don't have a control of the whole supply chain. So it's mainly linked to our direct operation, and especially at the first stage of the process of cement, that is the quarries, the extraction of raw materials that we need for the cement production. And here we have a biodiversity roadmap, and we want to contribute to this goal. So we classify as achievable. And in the downstream, some companies already have prepared products, concrete products, for example, to contribute making cities greener. So I also know projects related to other ecosystems, for example, marine ecosystems, and they use, for example, concrete solutions to create artificial reefs in this marine ecosystem. So this is a type of a contribution in a downstream value chain. The last one, land and soil. So we land and soil include in the rehabilitation plan. To extract the raw materials, you need to reduce all soil to achieve the raw materials. And this one of the main stages of the rehabilitation plan is the reintroduction of soil or substrate in the rehabilitation plan. So here to present our matrix. So my last slide is just acknowledgement, some acknowledge. So this roadmap was done by the task force members, so people that work within the industry and not only on office. We've been working in the field, mainly in quarries, and work with academia very closely. And it's not our day job because we also work in the cement companies. So I'm very proud to participate within this group and develop this roadmap. And of course, thanks to all the task force members and also SARE, the Society Ecological Restoration in Midlife, that contribute to several comments for this roadmap. Thank you very much. I hope I didn't exceed my time.
No, not too much, Alexandra. It's fine. Thanks a lot. It was very useful to also have a sectoral view on nature positive, or what it could mean for a sector. So I think it was a very clear explanation. Even also, it's good to see that apart from the wide range of measures, that you also start with quantifying, with concrete quantification, because that, of course, will need to be very crucial to demonstrate progress towards nature positive. So thanks to the three speakers. Now we have a little time for questions and answers. I see that many questions, well, a number of questions have come in, but they have been answered already, I think, to some degree, or even quite extensively by some of our speakers. So, but I think it's worth repeating a little bit the discussion about net gain and biodiversity positive. Is there a difference? It's indeed quite confusing. But I saw that Joe, although I haven't read the explanation, Joe has provided an extensive explanation. Maybe Joe, would you be willing to explain how you see the difference?
Yes, very happy to. And I think first to say that there's a couple of papers on this. The preprint that I included in the chat, which was mentioned by some of the other speakers, talks about this, and also there's an excellent paper by Professor Milner Gulland, which talks about this too, which I can put in the chat as well, or Johan, you could. I think for me, really, it's partly about the level of ambition. I think biodiversity net gain is part of policy increasingly in different parts of the world, different sectors. You know, obviously in England, there's a new biodiversity net gain law, and the thing with biodiversity net gain is, first of all, it focuses on biodiversity, which can be measured potentially in a quite narrow way, rather than nature more broadly, certainly in the way it's being talked about here, with other elements to it, not just biodiversity. But also, its biodiversity net gain can be judged against a relative scenario. So it could be business as usual, for example, which I wouldn't advocate, but it's possible to do. And what that means is that you can achieve biodiversity net gain, but your overall level of biodiversity could still be declining or deteriorating in the landscape or the seascape you're looking at, right? So that's one of the big differences. Whereas nature positive, I think, needs to be that extra level of ambition, where we're thinking about nature more comprehensively and also achieving relative gains in nature. Achieving absolute gains in nature.
Yeah. Thank you, Joe. Yeah, it's good to reiterate this. Thanks a lot. There was another question about conversion. land conversion, what it exactly means. I noticed that Katie provided an extensive answer. Katie, if you don't mind, can you explain?
Sure. Well, in simple terms, it just means the transformation of a natural habitat to a non-natural purpose. So it's usually
Your sound comes from quite far, Katie. I don't know. Can you come a little bit?
Sorry, I put my headphones on the wrong way around, which I sometimes do.
Now it's much better. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in very simple terms, it means the conversion of a natural ecosystem to a non-natural one. So it's often used in the context of forest risk commodities, which usually are considered to be cattle, soy, cocoa, and a range of other materials. But when you get down to it, it does have more technical definitions, and I provided some links in the chat to organizations that provide technical definitions of it. Because if you are an organization that has, for example, your own operations that impact on potentially forested areas, you do need to have like very concrete terminology and definitions of what you consider deforestation or not. And actually sometimes even in a broader sector level that's necessary. So in general, forest is defined as anything, any wooded area above 5 meters, which is a definition from the FAO, and I think there's a forest density definition for that as well. And conversion is a complete transformation of at least, I think, 1 hectare to a different material. But yeah, you can get more details on those in the links that I provided there. I hope that clarifies and doesn't make it more complicated.
Yeah, no. I think that's very useful. Thanks for putting the links in the chat too. I think that were the main questions. Other questions were more for practical things about receiving documents and so on, and the slide decks. I just want to come back very quickly on my question related to the downstream part. Life cycle assessment, to my opinion, covers all the value chain parts, including the downstream. Maybe a question for you, Joe. I saw that you have applied recipe, so you have applied different life cycle assessment based approaches. So isn't the downstream not automatically included in your analysis? Can you give us a very quick answer?
Well, just to say that not the full downstream, right? So some of the things we looked at with Oxford University relate to knowledge products, for instance, which aren't included. Some of our other clients, for instance, current clients are in the media or broadcast, and obviously they're influencing issues around nature conservation and climate change very strongly, but that downstream impact is quite hard to quantify. So yes, to some extent, materially, but not in terms of the broader downstream impact you talk about.
Okay, thanks. That's a very clear answer. So yeah, I think a few minutes left. I think it's good to wrap up. Thank you to all the speakers for your excellent presentations once again. Thanks for the audience. The next steps are the presentation of the findings, the conclusions, the overall conclusions of this webinar series in the European Business and Nature Summit, which will take place on 18 and 19 October in Brussels. Registrations are closed, I think, or almost closed at this moment. And so we'll have their final discussions on the nature positive. Well, final, they will go on for a while, I'm sure, but it will be again an interesting step in the debate. We'll have a panel discussion with a number of company representatives. We'll have Joe again with an academic view on what nature positive is. We have the announcement of the Business for Nature paper on nature positive. So the conclusions again of that particular session in the EBNS will feed other further deliverables with regard to nature positive, and one of them is a thematic report that we will publish with the platform in November on nature positive, also covering issues like water positive, another sensitive issue, not very clear definitions, and also carbon neutrality, also from the same perspective. So lots of things are going on. Thanks again for your interest and your contributions to the sessions. And as you know, we'll keep you informed about future activities and initiatives of the platform. I wish you all a very nice day. Bye-bye.